And we're back as promised for a roundtable on cyber. I don't know whether it's the most anticipated, but it's the one that was the most discussed. If we built a word cloud of the words that were mentioned whilst the experts were not yet on stage, we talked a lot about cyber. So I'll introduce the 5 experts around me. This is going to be a bilingual discussion, so if you're not comfortable with either of the 2 languages, do run out of the room.
So if you need a translation, don't hesitate.
And I'll try to stick to French to avoid Franglish, but I'm really happy to introduce with me Bernard Imperial. You're the co-founder of CY Wake, CY Wake. Both are okay. Okay. With you, we have Panagiotis CHRISTIAS. Hello, Panagiotis. You came straight from Greece, and you're Cybersecurity Director of MARGETIS Maritime Consulting. Welcome. We also have Howard Potter from ASTAARA. Fabien CAPARROS. You're a digital and cybersecurity advisor of the military and defense representation to the European Union. Hello. And Jean BAYON de la Tour, managing director at MARSH. You are the Europe cyber head at the European level based in Madrid. So although you're French, you're coming from very far away. Of course, Fabien is based in Brussels. I would first like to start with an overview of the cyber threat. And for that, I'll turn to Fabien. Where are we now? And why am I turning to you? Well, maybe things have changed a bit with, let's say, the military event of February 2022. Well, we can talk about war. Yes, you can talk about war. Well, the threat, it's not a scoop. The threat is alive and kicking. Unfortunately, especially in cybercrime, we are faced with an ecosystem which is very sophisticated, which is organized, in order to conduct a computer attack. You don't need to be on your own in the garage. These are very professional systems. You'll try to get access to a system that can be obtained on the dark web. You'll have a service provider that will give you the ability to cryptojack a system and then a system to extract a ransom. This ecosystem has reached a sophistication level that is close to the state threat, so much so that if you look at computer attacks now, technically it's difficult to distinguish, technically speaking, between a cyber criminal attack or another. Everybody's roughly using the same methods, and the other reason why the threat is alive and kicking is that there are still safe havens for them, and the war in Ukraine showed 2 things. First of all, there's been an amplification of cybercrime attacks. It was reported last year that there were plus 10% attacks on Europe, and there was also another event that was really striking. The fact that with Ukraine, we saw that there was a complete shift on what the attack advantage was. So Nathan Clark wrote the 6 domains, so US top experts. So for a threat, it's a lot more complicated when the attack makes an effort to reach, when defense reaches maturity. Attacking a system now like a boat takes months of pre-positioning. You need to penetrate the system, gain a foothold, stay there, and control your positioning. And if in this whole attack chain you're detected at any moment, the attacker is expelled and forced to go back from scratch. And so there's been a big lesson in cyber resilience and reliance after Ukraine. Ukraine repatriated all this data to data centers in the cloud that increased the cyber resiliency of infrastructure with new satellite communications. And so for an attacker, it's a lot more complicated now to carry out these computer attacks. So we have really entered the decade of resiliency. We started with the decade of protection with firewalls and antiviruses. Then we had the decade of detection with science foundations, and we could detect threats that could go over these protections. Now the question is really that of resilience. If we are doing things well, if you prepare correctly for a crisis, there will be an impact, but it seems that you'll stand every chance of overcoming it and come out stronger. And this work on resilience is essential, and all the work, all the doctrine that was developed on crisis management, the anticipation and survival skills means that the attack advantage has been reduced, and we can do a lot of things in terms of defense. Thank you for this optimistic note at the beginning of the discussion on cyber. That's something new. If you zoom in on maritime, Bernard, what can you say about this sector compared to the overall picture? Well, first of all, we had a good point of information, something published by France Cyber Maritime, an organization that was created a few years ago that I'm a trustee of, that analyzed the threat year after year, and the latest edition was published a few weeks ago. But there are specificities anyway in the cybersecurity issue in the maritime domain. It can be connected on the one hand to the utmost heterogeneity of ships, to the fact that we're talking about a broad sector. There's maritime shipping company, the port infrastructure, the logistical chain, and so on. What's more, there are traditional systems, IT, and then there are maritime industrial systems, especially on board ships. So what you can find on the bridge, what will manage propulsion, ballasting, and so on. And these are specific systems and protocols that can offer vulnerabilities that are known in industry. If you look at the current state of threats with current attacks, it's fairly well distributed between ship owners, shipping companies, port infrastructures, industry, so shipyards and OEMs, and the whole logistics chain. So it's roughly 20% each, with a strong increase in attacks on port infrastructure, and the war in Ukraine probably had a hand in it, and attacks on ship owners are still strong. And the other characteristic is that geographically Europe is the most impacted region. So that's sort of the landscape, but the underlying question is to know who has an interest in carrying out these attacks and for what consequences. So there's also a typology, which is very interesting for the world of insurance, a typology of consequences that can be losses, material losses, also the human impact, the compromised security and safety system on board ships. There can also be a risk on the image of a company. Some attacks on big shippers were widely covered in the media, and you can also have loss of business. So all these elements need to be classified with specificities in the maritime world on that. Howard, maybe an addition. In fact, in what Bernard was saying, it seems that, well, you discussed targeted attacks, but is the sector impacted mostly by targeted attacks, or is it covered or caught in the net of more random and more global attacks?
Absolutely. And in fact, probably the most famous example that people will know about is what happened to Maersk shipping line in Denmark about 5 years ago. They were not the target of that attack. That was actually an early iteration of Russian-Ukrainian aggression in the cyber field, which they simply got caught up in because of the software that they were using. What I think is interesting for us as an audience of marine insurance professionals If you're an underwriter or broker for hull insurance, you're interested in the ship. If it's cargo insurance, it's the goods on the ship, and not necessarily the factory that produces them or the office behind the shipping line. But in cyber, those boundaries do not exist. The cyber incident can cover the whole enterprise. So I think that's probably where the biggest paradigm shift is for us as an audience, is to get our heads around that. But certainly it's true that a lot of attacks are state-sponsored, but many of them are what I would call drive-by shootings rather than at the person that suffers.
Panagiotis. You're coming from a very different sector, which is the banking sector. And so in this maritime landscape that we've just described, maybe you can make an interesting comparison.
For the question, yes, I'm coming from the banking sector. I was working in the banking sector for about 35 years. And when I came in the marine sector, I was surprised because the banking sector, as you know, is the most sophisticated industry regarding cybersecurity. And the level of the maturity level of cybersecurity is very high there. Of course, banks invest a lot in cybersecurity, and this is the reason. Invest a lot in in people, in technical instruments, and compare it with the marine industry. Marine industry at this moment is in a basic level. I believe that all the ship owners have plans to invest in that area, but the plans goes to the future. I believe that this will start in 2024 due to the new provisions in IMO, and the ship owners should do something about cybersecurity, for sure, for compliance reasons, at least. This is my opinion about this.
Bernard, in addition to that, are ship owners aware of the risk? We talked about Maersk, but that's almost all the history now. The attack that affected Saint-Gobain, also in this country, we heard a lot about it at the global level, but now, has the sector become really aware of the magnitude of the risk? Well, of course, we're talking in the civil maritime world. We could also talk about the defense maritime world, where the level of awareness is a bit different. I'll ask Fabien later. I hope that it's a bit better in defense. That's a good question. But the war in Ukraine has highlighted some information. We can talk about it. When it comes to electronic warfare rather than cyber, problems related to GPS disruption, signals disruption. We had the plan in the Black Sea. Most ship owners are very aware of that. They're informed by the authorities of all that. So they know about it. But coming to cybersecurity purely, I think the issue is that it's neither underestimated nor overestimated. Very often in this sector, cyber newcomers tend to say that the ever-given problem could have been cyber, and maybe people can jam a container ship in the Suez Canal because of cyber means. It's not technically impossible, but the question is, for what goal? Who could do that? So you need to look at that at the right level. If you're a ship owner, for instance, and you're transporting cargo or passengers, you're not aware of the same level of threat that if you're doing fishing or pleasure boating. So the shipping companies that operate passenger ships are rather more sensitive to the risk than the companies that operate container ships. Harbors are different because most ports are by essence critical entities, sometimes vital importance operators, so there's no choice about that. About vital importance operators, OIVs in France, what are they? What are the rules that they need to comply with? So vital importance operators, and these vital operators are monitored by the Secretary General of Defense and National Security. They need to follow a certain number of risks in terms of security and cybersecurity, and they were the first operators to be regulated in the cyber realm with the military planning law, and they were asked to apply a number of rules to protect their most critical information systems, first to identify them, so vital importance IS, and then they should also be able to take action in case of a crisis, that measures that are requested by the authorities, and also have a number of cyber resilience capabilities around their business. For an OIV, a vital operator, the former general director of the French Cybersecurity Agency said that if a vital operator is impacted by an attack, there could be casualties based on that. And so that's the first rule in cybersecurity. That's why a number of measures were applied to OIVs. And the list of OIVs is top secret, it's classified, and so if you're a vital operator, you know it, but it can be, you can be annoyed if you're not a VIO, because that means you're not important enough. Coming back to you, Bernard. Well, overall, if you're looking outside these specific cases in the marine world, there's been progress. If you look back 2 or 3 years, there's been progress. We've gone from a form of neglect to awareness, but a lot of actions need to be put in place. So ship owners have started drafting documents. It's very administrative, their approach, but they're not yet at a level of organized solutions because they think that this threat can still be a bit diffuse, or because it hasn't been presented correctly compared to what we said earlier. The cliche for a very long time was that since you're a ship, since you're relatively cut off from the world, you're not impacted by this threat. Howard, is that no longer applicable?
It's applicable up to a certain point. I think that for vessels, and again, as hull and machinery underwriters and brokers in the audience will be used to talking about hull insurance, insurance for ships, as being purely about physical damage. Now, yes, a cyber incident might cause some physical damage. I would say the likelihood of that is low, but that's why you buy insurance, is because something might happen. What is more likely, and certainly what we're seeing is, and this is where insurance products probably need to evolve in order to cover the risks that are actually happening, is non-physical damage. Now that's quite hard for us as marine insurers to get our heads around, because we are, whether we're hull, cargo, it's very much about physical damage, impact, something happening. But non-physical damage can be as simple as a screen on a bridge goes blank. What happens? Now that doesn't necessarily mean that, and in fact almost certainly doesn't mean that the ship is going to sink or collide or anything like that going to happen, because it has human beings on board who are not going to let that happen. That's what they're trained to do. But you can still have the costs of dealing with the incident. You can have the costs of prosecuting the voyage. There might be delay. You might miss your Suez Canal slot. That is extra costs. You might need to replace some hardware which could be to do with the navigation system, the steering or the propulsion of the vessel. All of these are costs, but they're not typically physical damage. So I think, again, we have to think about what is happening and then make sure that any insurance solution meets that.
Well, precisely, you were talking about insurance. I wanted really to address the elephant in the room, and I know that you don't necessarily agree, all of you, starting with Bernard. Is there cyber maritime insurance products? Well, to be a bit provocative in the room, I would say no. The reality is not quite that. And, well, there are few products. because now there's not a lot of demand. If you're discussing with brokers, well, demand from ship owners is not really there. There needs to be demand for there to be a supply. I'm really talking about marine. Cyber insurance overall exists, and it's very, very efficient and effective. But then you need to distinguish situations. What type of insurance are you trying to subscribe? Loss of income and business? Or are you talking about physical damage because of hull and engines? Are these issues related to ransomware? So a demand, people will demand a ransom. The company is completely frozen, and their data will only be returned against a big check. Yes, that's ransomware. And so there's this whole issue now. So you need to find insurers that will redeem these exclusion clauses. It's an exclusion clause in hull and machinery. And to do that, you need to control the risk. You need to know it. And that's probably why there's a very little supply in terms of insurance. So logically, this is when I give the floor to the broker. Jean, is there demand and is there supply? I'll answer yes and yes. But cyber insurance is fairly recent if you compare with marine insurance and traditional damage insurance. It's only been 20 to 25 years, so we are learning as we are doing, sometimes by trial and error, but we're learning and the market is growing. So for cyber insurance overall, there are 10 to 15 billions worth of premiums. It's small, but it's almost as big as aviation. So it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's applied to all sectors, including marine and aviation. But then insurers will have a sector-by-sector view. And as was said before, the marine sector is seen as lagging behind other sectors like defense or banking in terms of protection. Yes, protection. So the first analysis by insurers is to say that these sectors are very exposed, very reliant on their IS, just in time, but then the protection levels are slightly below that. So I did a quick computation before I came here for the 10 key computer control systems. If they were deployed to the tune of 73% at the global levels, it's only 68% in the transport sector. It's a bit below, but that's significant. So banks are a bit above that, but that's something that insurers take into account. And that's a bit annoying for us. And you can see all these claims. We mentioned Maersk or Toll Group in Australia. I'm taking examples so that I don't mention any sensitive names, but they're found everywhere in Europe and France also. But you need to scope what you're talking about. In insurance, we tend to be a bit basic. There's cause and impact. We're talking about malicious attacks, cyber attacks, internal or external, all types of cyber attacks. And so we talked about material damage and non-physical damage. And things need to be addressed on both sides. And there are solutions available on both sides, either with redemption of exclusions or specific policies for non-physical damage. There are sector specificities when you're a ship owner or an operator. There are chains of responsibility that are specific. There are specific insurers as well that can address that understand, and that can provide solutions. So I'm seeing that as a challenge. We need to keep improving. We need to keep listening to our clients and their specificities, but there's an offering right now. And if you're asking the clients that I mentioned a minute ago, they received compensation for the policy they subscribed. So some insurers, a couple of years ago, when they paid more claims than they cashed in terms of premiums, they thought it worked a bit too well, this matter of cyber insurance. So yes, it is working. It doesn't mean it's all rosy, but we'll keep improving. Howard, on the existence of insurance products, we need to listen to you.
Right. I'd take up Bernard's point, which was interesting about the whole supply and demand side of it. Is there a demand for this kind of product? And of course, there will never be a demand that is properly met if the products are not right for the situation. And of course, as you said, Jean, you're absolutely right. You've got marine on the one hand that's hundreds of years old, and you've got cyber that's 20 years old. So there is very much a learning process in all of this, which we're all part of. I think examples of that would be hull and machinery. It's not just about physical damage. You have to ensure non-physical damage. You have to ensure the office as well, not just the metal that goes to sea, because cyber will cover the entire business. Another example might be, if anybody here is involved in the transport and logistics sector, again, much more likely to be an office-based enterprise cyber incident. But what happens if the goods that the logistics company is handling on behalf of the goods owner, they go missing because of a cyber incident, or temperature sensitive goods go off because of a cyber incident? Maybe that goods owner will go back against the logistics company under their contracts, the liability contracts that we all know about, and say, hang on a minute, because you weren't good enough at your cybersecurity controls, because you didn't train your people, perhaps you didn't patch your systems in time, then all of the limitations of liability that a carrier would normally have, let's say 2 SDRs per kilogram, whatever it might be, they don't apply. We're going to claim for the full value of those goods. So again, that changes the nature of transport and logistics and cargo insurance. So this is very much about thinking through what might happen and then making sure that there is a product there that reasonably can cover fortuities. Not things that are going to happen anyway. It has to be fortuities. Do you agree?
Panagiotis, regarding the insurance aspect, I know that you're a cybersecurity expert, but are you also working with your colleagues internally in risk management and insurance? And are you going forward hand in hand?
Yes, I believe that the companies, first of all, should understand the maturity, the cybersecurity maturity level. If they understand this level, then maybe this will be inserted in a clause in insurances in order to make a better insurance to the companies that it has a better level of cybersecurity maturity level, is in a better level. I believe that this will be connected with insurance. The cybersecurity level will be connected with insurance.
We've talked about some damage that was compensated, some claims that were paid, but in concrete terms, around cyber, it was widely said that there was a systemic risk. So, is the sector worried? Could this become systemic? We saw the first big attacks with indeed a chain reaction. Fabien, Jean? Well, maybe I can start, gladly. There was a very good interview a few months or years ago of Thomas Bobel, the CEO of AXA. It's smart, so it's not coming from me. That's why I'm quoting. He said that all risks will either be managed by digital or will become systemic. And so you can take motor liability, automotive liability. So with autonomous cars, you won't subscribe your own insurance personally. It will be an interconnected fleet. And so if there's a problem, malicious or not, with the computer system, there will be a big problem. So all risks are getting systemic because of digital. Consequently, cyber risk is systemic. My analysis is that cyber risk is systemic by nature. And if insurers don't want to cover part of this systemic risk, don't do cyber at all. It's a bit provocative, but we need to really become so extreme. But you need to distinguish between systemic and catastrophic. There are some catastrophic scenarios with a magnitude and severity that should make you think. And insurance is scratching its head around three main types of scenarios: war issues that were exacerbated by what is happening in Ukraine, infrastructure issues, power and telecommunications. If Orange goes dark, we have a problem with the French economy. And then there's the IT supply chain, all IT vendors, big cloud providers, and so on. And then there are debates about what could be the potential severity of these three catastrophic scenarios. I think that the infrastructure scenario is fairly clear. It goes well beyond what insurers can cover. But for the other two, that's an open debate. And so the biggest work we need to do now is to pool our data, to pool our claims experience, to quantify. We have a scenario on the third aspect called Move It. We manage claims, so it's a vulnerability impacting a lot of clients. And I saw that it impacted our biggest competitor yesterday, so I'm amused by that. But anyway, it's another systemic scenario that is rising, and we need to see how we can get as much data as possible to see the potential severity. Cloud aspects, there are a couple of big cloud providers globally. They are well segregated. So is this a scenario that one cloud provider will go fully dark for 24, 48, 72 hours? We saw that fires could already have some impact. Yes, absolutely. And what is interesting, in the latest report by our sister company called Gary Carpenter, could say that it could cost $15 to $35 billion, a systemic scenario on clouds. The premium is $15 billion. It's not enough, but it's not light years away. If it's catastrophic, it won't be good news for insurers, but that wouldn't make them go bankrupt. And a natural disaster is 50 to 100 billion in Florida and so on. So this quantification is not catastrophic. Others are. The Lloyd scenario is closer to 100 billion, if my memory serves. So that's what we need to improve to calibrate the response and tell customers, well, whether there are exclusions or not. Well, we won't pay because it's too big for us. And then I was lucky to be in Brussels yesterday to speak to some European commissioners. There are discussions in the US, in Europe, in the UK, about a potential government backstop, as you've got in France. Should we go so far, maybe, to handle these catastrophic topics?
Fabien, actually, I wanted to hear you on the disaster part of things and the way that people are working on these topics in Brussels. From a systemic standpoint, as Jean-Louis was saying, this is part and parcel of what we do. That being said, we also need to know better risks and technologies. I would say the problem is, de facto, when it comes to digital technologies, you'll have waves of technologies which are disruptive coming in, and with every disruptive wave, you immediately find yourself with an increased level of vulnerability, since you need to understand better the technology to be more secure, leading to systemic risks. So earlier on, you were saying that we were in an enhanced phase, but with quantum computing and AI, there might be a reverse effect along the way. Absolutely. The cloud effect is very helpful. However, when you put data on the cloud, respecting sovereignty, so, for example, having a cloud with data in Europe, it'll be harder for an adversary to attack a cloud because with a cloud, you can close your doors much more easily. So you have that cloud effect, which is very helpful at the moment, but that might not necessarily be the case tomorrow. Maybe that will change. Maybe certain cloud providers will go bankrupt. With AI as well, so many question marks. Europe is currently working on a future regulation on AI. Why am I saying that there are question marks? Well, AI may accelerate the potential agility of criminals in their attacks. And to answer your question specifically, with regards to the systemic aspects of things, digital disruptions. Well, in the maritime sector, the land-sea gap is gradually moving away. With low orbit satellites, for example, there will be the possibility to be connected to ships at a similar pace than connections on land. That interconnectedness does not mean that we cannot secure it all, but potentially we may find ourselves in a situation where we may suffer from vulnerabilities which may lead to entire fleets being paralyzed, which would be completely unprecedented. Where is Europe standing in all of this? We're doing two things. First of all, Europe has grown aware of its power to regulate vis-a-vis the GDPR and vis-a-vis many other things, says the moderator. So Europe wants to regulate and take over a number of topics with regards to its own digital European territory with extraterritorial effects. So in doing so with our Resilience Act, we'll be tackling questions in relation with IoTs. We'll also have an AI Act. However, we need to be consistent on a European level for all of these regulations to be applicable. Contrary to this, you have the Anglo-Saxon world with contracts. But a certain level of maturity is being reached. So we've reached a certain threshold of maturity there. And the systemic dimension of cyberspace will always be here. It will be here through the various waves of digital disruptions. And on a European level, we have truly decided to control this with regulations and with support. So it's very interesting for private companies to discuss with EU commissioners to keep that relationship going so as to avoid any surplus regulations. Too much regulation isn't good either. Now, regulation is a solution amongst many others, but when it comes to risk management, very concretely, what can be done better? Anything that can be improved there? Panagiotis.
Of course, all the companies have to face several cybersecurity risks. For marine industry, ashore and on board. They have to understand that cyber risks are not only the cyber attacks. Cyber risk is something more than cyber attacks. We have administrative errors, human errors, malfunctions in the systems, natural disasters, unexpected events, and we have regulation risks. So every company should implement a strong cybersecurity framework. In order to do that, all the companies should have the right people to do that. One thing, they have to have a cybersecurity expert for this, and not to put this responsibility only to IT, because in most of the companies, the IT persons play the same role as the cybersecurity role. Beyond of that, they should invest in technology and in education to the people, in order all the people in the company, all the employees, including the top management, to be aware for the risks that each company has to face. If the companies do that, I believe that they can manage and handle all the cybersecurity risks that they have to face. Because, of course, the technology growing rapidly, and it's very difficult for the people always to be aware about the new development. So the training of the people is very critical for me in order to face this risk.
Howard, peut-être un
Howard, perhaps a few words on risk management.
That it falls into those same two areas. IT, technology, that is certainly part of the solution. It's absolutely something that is a given and has to be there. And of course, as an insurer, you can say you must have this level of email protection, you must, I don't want to get too technical, but you must have a privileged access management user tool or something like that. And then you either insure the risk or you don't. But essentially, for me, I think the biggest, most important piece of risk management is actually the people risk management, and it's the training, because you can have the best IT systems in the world, but of course the minute you give a computer to a human being, mistakes can happen, which again is why you buy insurance. So for me, it's about training. I think a lot of the regulation that we're seeing, so IMO, the International Maritime Organization, coming in by saying that cyber has to be taken account of in a ship's safety management system, the SMS, which is an annual certification. By saying cyber is part of that, along with safety of life and protection of the environment. By saying that, they're saying you must have cyber drills on your ships. If a screen goes blank, your officers and your crew have to know what they're going to do. And if you're not, then potentially you're unseaworthy. And of course, that's the one big thing that will make any ship owner sit bolt upright and say, if I'm not seaworthy, I've got much, much bigger problems. So regulation does help with putting risk management where it needs to be. And for me, the focus is on the people side.
Bernard, what would be your recommendations for solid risk management? I would say you need to look at various levels. You spoke of solutions earlier on. I would say that the first level of response, institutional response, with a series of rules and proposals which were put on the table by the French Maritime Department to best face maritime risks in the first levels of coverage. Also, you have French Cyber Maritime with EMCERT, the Maritime Emergency Response Center, which was launched in Brest and collects all information. That is also an excellent source of risk analysis and support in such a context. We spoke of aeronautics, and I'm quite convinced that we have so much to learn from aeronautics when it comes to the approach. Now, from a timing and regulations perspective, things are very different. So I was about to say many lessons to be learned and a lot of delay to catch up on. And indeed, when it comes to plane, of course, there are immediate risks, which are much higher perhaps than on a ship, but there are a few points in common to dig in. So I would say go from an approach that's checkbox based to an approach whereby you have a governance that's defined, where you've taken into consideration all human aspects, where you undertake an in-depth risk analysis study, onboarding all technologies and technical details in order to reach a solution. And mind you, when it comes to technical solutions for IT, it's not really what's the most complicated in the topic. All right, so perhaps this is a topic I would like us to dig into, and perhaps certain people here in the room might want to ask a few questions on these cyber topics. Right at the back of the room, on the very left. Thank you so much for your presentations. A quick comment. Currently, there is no international regulation on cybersecurity and ships. There's a resolution from the IMO, which was mentioned by our speakers, but it's very brief, just 3 paragraphs, so it's not quite as specific as it should be. France went beyond by imposing more strict regulations on cybersecurity and aboard on ships. So my question is simple. Would you be for or against a global regulation on cybersecurity management aboard of ships? Who would like to go first? Bernard, perhaps? Well, first of all, since we're speaking about developments, there's been a clear development lately. IMO rules, as you rightly said, are only very limited and permissive, but there are rules which are on the way on new constructions, which will be enforced by 2024, and these will be much more limiting for shipyards and for ship owners. Number 2, indeed, regulations and insurance are excellent drivers, so I would be for to answer your question, as we saw in aeronautics. Maybe a quick comment. In the banking world, this is something that very early on was tackled and addressed internationally with international rules and regulations, and these are amongst the most mature sectors today when it comes to cybersecurity. So having some sort of a global harmonized sector would be pushing the entire sector in the right way. And here I think that Europe is very pushy, as we were saying earlier, with Nice and now Nice 2, which will be much more ambitious and cover many more maritime actors. And I think it will be laying the right foundations to push companies in that direction towards more IT maturity. I fully agree with you. Regulation is a way to support. Regulation is a way to support maturity. And today, the insurance system, as it exists, works really well for most risks in the freight forwarding sector, and whenever there's an incident that's happening, even if it's on the other side of the world, you have a whole assessment chain that's triggered. So for cyber risks, the idea was not to start from scratch, but rather to integrate cyber risks in that system. And now regulations will be gradually supporting that entire movement. And then should there be anyone reluctant, then they'll have to be convinced with these regulations. We also had the very first European directive making it compulsory for cybersecurity to lead to an actual risk management system, but that only targeted large operators. Maturity is on the rise, and with the Nice 2 directive, we'll be able to catch up on a wider number of operators. Freight forwarding is a sector that's very much at risk, so there will be new entities defined with essential entities, important entities, and they'll have to implement a number of rules. So we're going from a national regulation to regional regulation, and naturally this should give way to international regulation. So in the long run, I would say that we'll be moving towards an IMO kind of regulation in the same way that it happened in the air sector. But should risk management systems work really well, well, regulations will happen quite naturally and will flow naturally. I believe there was a question by you, sir. Yes, hello. Thank you so much, our panelists, for taking the floor. Thank you for your clarifications on cyber risks. Very insightful. Here's my question. We can all see that cyber risks represent colossal financial risks. So my question is, should insurance companies on their own, or should each insurance company offer solutions, bearing in mind that this would require rather large funds? Or perhaps we could think of some kind of a pooling system, as we have with our CatNat system for natural disasters. So this is a risk that is quite wide, and so it should not be supported by just one single insurer, but rather with an entire system, a system that would be similar to our CatNat scheme. Okay, so quite a political question. Well, I'll speak as a former regulator, but I'll let my co-panelists answer that question. This is a question that was put on the table and was studied as part of a working group, which was led by the Treasury. A number of players participated in that working group, but you have insurance companies. Okay, and then you have the CatNat scheme, but there are many other solutions in between to strengthen resilience capacities, and the CatNat scheme is usually the last resort. I'm no expert again, but this is something that's on the way, and I would say that state players, especially on a European level, would want to implement a backstop or a natural disaster kind of system when the time is right, to support the insurance industry and to make sure that the resilience and reassurance industry can hold tight. This is a topic, for example, which was discussed yesterday in Brussels, and it's been discussed for various years, and it's reaching certain maturity. And all of the levels will have to go through to go all the way to the backstop. We're on the way, but we're not quite there yet. There are mutual insurance companies which are being created throughout the world, whereby certain players are pooling their resources to increase their capacities. There are local players in Brussels also, which are adding to the general capacity. There are main reinsurers, which are jumping in, cyber cat bonds as well, which are bringing more equity to all of this. But above all of that, apart from well-identified risks, perhaps we would need a backstop system, but it should only demultiply the capacity of insurers. It should not be in lieu of. This is something that can only be built gradually, especially since we're not completely clear on the disaster scenarios just yet. They have not been completely defined. I think it will happen. There was an interesting report published by the UK. I can't really remember who published that report. In any case, in the end, it concluded that backstop is a great idea, but on our own in the UK will only be too small. We will not be able to be efficient. The US was wondering exactly the same. Maybe on a European level, we might have the right size to create a pool with enough premiums, but that would lead to a whole host of questions. That pool for natural disasters, it can insure companies based in France. When you are an international company based in France, the European backstop will cover you, but if the plant that's actually impacted is based in the US, should the European backstop pay for that claim? And with cyber risks, you have absolutely no geographic lines and borders. So will Europe finance the relaunch and recovery of a plant that would be based in the US? Many questions on the table, but it's all quite new, but we're getting there. Maybe one last question. Now's the time. Okay, so what are your key takeaways? One key takeaway in the room as ship owners, as insurers, one key takeaway. Okay, I'll start by saying we need to be optimistic. We're in this together. We'll be improving cybersecurity and cyber insurance. In order to reach the right cyber insurance package, we want to have the right level of maturity, and now we can see somewhat of a return on investment. And we have quantified the impact of cyber security controls on the decrease in cyber risks and their frequency. So as insurance prescribers, 20, 25 years down the line, we're there. We're getting there. We can now bring added value to IT teams on what works and what doesn't in terms of controls. It will not be their sole source of information, but it is a valid one. So they may push their very own top management to release more budget, to inject more budget on certain priorities. Cyber risks is not a strategic or an it's not a technical or an operational risk for any entity, public or private. Cyber risks are strategic. Since it's potentially lethal, it cannot be avoided, and it cannot be outsourced. So it should be managed by the top management. That means various things. First of all, awareness. People need to be aware. You'll need to put the resources, the right resources where they should be. You need to understand and get organized, and that can only be made possible through risk analysis, and this is something that I can only recommend to you. So understand, get organized, put into place a strategy, then you build up your security foundations, protection, defense, and resilience most of all now, and then you need to look at this in the long run. So you need to be agile and question regularly your very own exposure to risks and the way you've organized yourself to face that risk. This is all part of our book that we published a few years ago, Control Your Risks. And this is an approach that we wanted to develop for companies so they can better understand their very own cyber risks. But again, cyber risks are strategic. This is not a technical risk which can be left up to a service provider. It's a question for top management.
Was a bit of a sentence behind. I think what we've heard today is that this is a real risk, even if conceptually it's a very big subject. My message would be that as marine professionals, it's something that we can't run away from, and it's certainly something that we shouldn't be afraid of, because it's always going to be there. Simple as that.
I would like to say that, to point out that the technological environment is a critical factor for a company, for a company's asset protection. And what we mean is assets. Assets are the people, the systems, the data, and the infrastructure. All of these are the assets. Cyber risk is not connected only with IT. It's a systemic risk. The cyber risk is a systemic risk for me, affecting the whole enterprise. And of course, cybersecurity is not a responsibility for one person. Cybersecurity is responsibility for all the employees of the company, including the top manager, of course.
Bernard, ce sera le mot de la fin.
Bernard, a word to conclude? Well, first of all, as we have heard, this is a strategic risk indeed, and let us not over nor underestimate it. It should be gauged properly. If you're a ship and you go through, I mean, there are certain routes which are more dangerous than others, and this should be taken into consideration. Also, for maritime companies, do not take pirates on board due to the human factor, first of all. Involuntarily someone do not take any wrongdoer, any pirate on board. And surprisingly, as we've said, the level of awareness is quite low, when in fact, as we've heard, and this was a really interesting example, maritime piracy is here, and this is a parallel we should have in mind. We have response centers, so with upstream risk analysis, that's kind of approach that's very interesting, and it should inspire managers, because as we said, it's not something that can be managed at IT department level. One last thing. We need digital consistency throughout the chain, which is not the case for the moment. And in order to do that, you need to connect the dots between maritime companies, ports, class companies, industrials, insurers, and connecting those dots is far from obvious. That's what we try to do as specialized companies in the sector. Okay, thank you to the 5 of you. A warm round of applause indeed.